Good morning, everyone. I'm out here on a chilly morning to do a plant ID, botany hike, taxonomy Tuesday event for you. I'm here in between Millstad and Dupo at the woods at my house. We have about 4 acres of a mesic, oak hickory woods, definitely in the Illinois Ozarks region. So we have pretty big hills, along with ravines, a lot of erosion, a lot of birds calling right now. So I'm gonna head out here. We're gonna look for spring ephemerals mostly just because that's what is up right now. Spring ephemerals just mean that they are plants that leaf out and bloom during the springtime. They are almost completely gone the rest of the growing season. That's not just the flowers, but also the leaves. They disappear after they're done blooming. So we're gonna head out, see what we can find. It's beginning of April, so we're a little bit early still. But there are some things up, and hopefully we'll find some cool ones today. So our first stop is along what I like to call the stairway to heaven, leading up to the ridge top there. There's this nice little hummock here that's holding extra soil, and you can see the moss growing there. There's 4 species here I'd like to show you, all of which are relatively common, not incredibly rare, and that you'll see on a variety of different sites. So first up here, let's see if I can find one that is in bloom. We have Claytonia virginica, which gets known by the common name spring beauties or Virginia spring beauties. It has pretty much only 2 leaves to it. Sometimes you'll still see the cotyledons at the base, but it has these 2 linear shaped leaves, and then it has a handful of blooms near the top. Typically there's only 1 or 2 blooming at a time. This one you can see there's 2 that are mostly blooming, a couple more coming on, and then one here that's past bloom. These are relatively common. You'll see them all over the woods. Sometimes you can find them in carpets in people's lawns, especially if you're a very shaded lawn surrounded by woods. They hold on really well. When you lose a lot of your spring ephemerals, a lot of times you can still find these ones, so it's pretty neat about them. They are some of the first blooming things you will see in the springtime. They are definitely in abundance here. My second one I would like to show you is this guy here. Probably well known by many of you as well. It is a trillium species. Sometimes they're known as wake robins or toadstools even. This one is Trillium erectum. Some of the identifying features of it, first of all, that it has the 3 leaves for trillium, but also that the leaves are attached directly to the stem. They're sessile, meaning they don't have a little branch or petiole connecting them. And also, you can see that the flower is attached directly to the stem. These flowers are not yet open. They are a dark red, reddish purple color. I'm sure we'll come across more that are open, and I'll show those to you. This is Trillium erectum. Moving up from that one, we have a fern species. Ferns can be pretty difficult to identify. They tend to look a lot alike. You're not relying on flowers, so it can be tricky unless you want to spend a lot of time to get to know them. This is a really common one, sometimes even considered a weedy fern. It is called Christmas fern, which is Polystichum acrostichoides. You can see last year's growth towards the bottom here. This is pretty thin, brittle fronds here. They're from last year. You can see they're even burned a little bit from the fire that we had. They hold on all winter long, all summer long, so that they can continue to photosynthesize. In the spring, from the same plant, it shoots up these new fronds, these fiddleheads, And that's the new growth, and they'll put on these really bright green leaves that will look much nicer in comparison to these ones. Some of the identifying features of the Christmas fern that makes it easy to spot, first of all, is the really, really hairy stems that you see on these new fronds. They will persist on the leaves when they're totally opened. These almost 2-year-old plants don't have much of that fuzz left to them anymore. It's pretty much gone away, but throughout the growing season, the new leaves will have this really, really hairy stem, very noticeable in comparison to other ferns. Additionally, if we take a look at one of these, the reason it gets the name Christmas fern, see if I can hold that upright, is because of the shape of these. It almost looks like a little boot or maybe a Christmas stocking. So that little point there sticking out, you can see, and that is an identifying feature. So if you think of the Christmas stockings, that's how you can remember the Christmas fern. Lastly, at this spot, our fourth species is this one right here. This is Geum canadense, also known as white avens. Can be a little bit difficult to identify by using a dichotomous key because it has polymorphic leaves, meaning that the leaves have very variable shapes, maybe at different points in the growing season and on the same plant, so it can be difficult to describe. But what you can look at to notice this species or to be able to identify this species is the veins that are present, kind of have a whitish color. It ends up giving the leaf a little bit of a variegated look to it. And this is a little bit older of a leaf. This is a new fresh one that's brighter green. They are slightly fuzzy. This is the basal rosette of the plant. You can see there is a new stem coming up here. It'll put on some more foliage and also the flower. So this is white avens. Remember it by the whitish veins, the purplish red stems, the basal rosette, highly dissected leaves. But don't get too caught up in the specific leaf shape because they can be quite variable from plant to plant and even within the same plant. So we are going to head back uphill, working our way up the ridge. Have a few more steps here, continuing on up to an area to show the difference when you have a wall of honeysuckle and then an area that's recently been cleared. So all this here is bush honeysuckle. These are pretty large ones. They can get much larger. I know most of you know these or know this species already. You can see it has a woody stem. This year's growth though has pinkish, very soft stems to it. Opposite leaves, bright green leaves. This is a small guy. They bloom May and June with white and yellow flowers. But it's pretty invasive. It takes over everything, and it's hard to really grasp how much damage it does until you look over here to a spot that's been very recently cleared from honeysuckle. It's totally barren. Actually, the only greenery that you see is probably the resprouts from the roots of some of them that we cut. So they really just need more herbicide application. Hopefully 2 to 3 years from now, this will be responding either through the seed bank, so the seeds that are remaining in the soil, probably some seed that I add to the area myself, but also seed rain. You can see uphill here on the forest floor, there's some dark green coverage. Those are actually mayapples that I'll show you in a little bit, but they're uphill of this site, and so you can imagine that as their fruits ripen, and of all the other species, as their seed ripens and is released, it can kind of work its way with gravity downhill, helping to revegetate this area. And what's especially nice here, which has a lot of hope for this spot, is that we had a very large tree waterfall right there. And so there's a lot more canopy opening, and this will get a lot more light. So we have really high hopes for this location. All right, now I am traveling along a ridge line that runs east-west. There's some pretty noticeable things about it that I'd like to point out. Because it runs east-west, we have a northern and southern aspect slope coming from it. Here to my right is the northern slope. You can see there's actually not all that much honeysuckle leafed out on it. Some of it's been removed, which is really nice. But I'd like to point out all of these smaller tree stems that you can see. There's actually quite a lot of them, of that 2, 3, maybe even 4-inch range. A lot of that is sugar maples, some elms, slippery elms mostly, and black cherry. We have, you can see that one large black cherry there that really adds a lot of seed to the area for black cherry. So those 3 species I mentioned are all what we call mesophytic species. They do really, really well on these north or protected slopes that get less sunlight on them. Dries out less because of that, and also it doesn't have quite as much wind, so they stay moister. The leaf litter kind of clings to the ground more, and it really changes the tree composition, but also changes the understory as well with herbaceous species. And then if you take a look here to my left, which is the southern aspect, southern slope, there's a lot more honeysuckle in the distance. It hasn't yet been cleared, but hopefully you can notice that there's not nearly as many small trees. That's because the southern slope gets a lot more sun, dries out a lot more, and we barely have any of the sugar maples over here, little to no elm, and absolutely no black cherry. So that helps because it doesn't quite shade the forest floor nearly as much. You still have the honeysuckle, of course, which helps in that, but it changes the composition of the species that you see. Including the spring ephemerals, even though they're out before all of the tree leaves are out, it still has an effect on them. So that's quite a difference. I'm going to keep moving along here, along this ridge line, and try to find you a couple more species. I have a good looking one over here. This one blooms pretty early, just like the Virginia bluebells. But this one is cutleaf toothwort, which is a cardamine species. This one is Cardamine contantiana. You can see it has highly dissected leaves, probably why it's called cutleaf. And it has white flowers. Sometimes they might be a pale pink or a pale purple, but they're mostly white. 4 petals, which is pretty typical of cardamine species. They'll all be blooming at about the same time. Like I mentioned, these start pretty early. They can start middle to even beginning of March around here. Their stems are only maybe 6 inches tall or so they're pretty low. They can be quite prolific even in shaded areas, but a lot of times you'll see them just vegetative where they have these leaves, but they do not have any blooming flower heads on them. So you'll see these around quite a bit, and you can see any greenery in the distance there pretty much is this cardamine species, cutleaf toothwort. Alright, I'm now traveling downhill some, where I'm going to take a look at a small population of Mayaples, but it's a mature population. It's been here a few years, and I know that because these plants, most of them at least, have a bifurcated stem. So first year Mayaples, I don't even see one. Here we go. Here's one. First year Mayaples come up on a single stem with a single umbrella leaf overhead. These ones will not flower this year. They will just work on building up their rootstock, gaining energy, and then next year when they come back, they will look like this guy that has 2 umbrella leaves at the top and the small flower in between. This one's still just developing. It's going to get a lot larger and eventually will droop below the stem, and it's a large white flower with many petals on it. Stays relatively hidden from the umbrella leaves, and probably midsummer starts to fully develop a large fruit, maybe about quarter-sized, a little bit larger. That is actually edible, but I don't think tastes very good. And these are mayaples, and you'll find them a lot in these big colonies. They are clonal, so they reproduce rhizomatiously underground. So that's why you find these pods of them. They can persist for quite a while, probably just because they reproduce rhizomatiously. So even when things get really shaded out or degraded, they can still underground keep reproducing. That's what makes them quite common. But they're a fun one to see in the spring. They usually pop up about the end of March or so. And their bright green color and their large populations make it really fun. And they're almost a little bit whimsical looking. So everyone seems to really enjoy them. Something else I'm spotting at this location that's neat. Let me find some good ones. They are just seedlings still, but these guys here, you can see, have 4 leaves. 2 of them, these 2, are the cotyledons to the plant, and then those 2, top and bottom, are the 2 true leaves that are the first 2 leaves to emerge. This is called jewelweed or impatiens. This species is Impatiens capensis. So it's the orange flowering jewelweed. Some people know it by the name touch-me-not, trumpet flower, or jewelweed, or just impatient. It is a summer bloomer, so this plant's going to get much, much larger, and won't bloom probably till June. There is another species that we have in this area. It's a yellow flowering one. It's more of an upland species. The orange flower, Impatiens capensis, that you see here, that is a phac wet species. So it's more common. You'll see it on slopes, but you also see it, along ditches and floodplains, places like that. And it's really, we have almost a carpet in some places of these seedlings. This is a spot that's been burned 2 years in a row, so I think it's actually very responsive to fire, and it's a good native species, so I'm happy to see that. I imagine that this area is going to be pretty thick in it, and thick with those orange flowers come June and July. I'm going to move over to another slope and see if we can scrounge up some more species for you. Alright, I am walking along another southern facing slope. Just have some pretty good ground flora diversity. One of the first ones I'm spying that really is just emerging. This here is golden seal, which is Hydrastis canadensis. What's cool about it is it's coming up from a single stem. Well, it's multi-stem, but on a single stem. There's this palmate leaf, like a hand, palmate, just starting to open. It's very scrunched up still, and it has a second leaf that's even tinier, thumbnail size, that's starting to open, but it already has its flower bud ready to go. That's pretty cool. Very anxious to reproduce, I guess. Golden seal is one of those plants, kind of like ginseng, that was harvested for its medicinal properties. I believe it's the root also with golden seal. It is I would call it a spring ephemeral. And this flower opens up. It's a very frilly white flower, quite noticeable, and then a red berry replaces it. It's a cool one to find. Usually it's clonal also. It does reproduce underground. I don't see any other stems of it, but it might be a little bit early. So that's a fun one to spy. Now we're going to head further uphill because I know of another neat spring ephemeral up here. So this one I'm looking for is Jack in the Pulpit, which is somewhat of a rare spring ephemeral. It's a little bit more, persists on the high quality sites. So this is Jack in the Pulpit. It is not a trillium. It does have 3 leaves. When you look at it, one of the big differences is that it points one leaf mostly upwards and the other 2 are pointed down. So the Latin name for this one is Erysimea triphyllum. The 3 leaves, a triphyllum. It's called Jack in the Pulpit, and I see a flowering stalk already. Alright, exciting news. I turned around and caught a glimpse of another Jack in the Pulpit that is fully open, so you can see it better. Again, these are the leaves, the 3 leaves. And then this is the spathe and spadix. You can see the spathe quite well. It's green. It's got the maroonish tinge to it. That maroon color, kind of that dark red, almost brown color, is usually used to attract things like flies, not things like butterflies or moths. So this might be one of those species that's pollinated by flies. You can see the spadix way down in there. It's just starting to develop, and that's where the pollen will be. So they're not a showy flower. They're pretty unique. Like I mentioned, high quality. They're pretty though. If you look hard for them, they're a little bit of a special treat. All right, we're gonna keep moving along because I know of a population over this way of a relatively rare-ish spring ephemeral called large flower bellwort. So this is a nice little pod of it, mostly what's growing right here. It's Uvularia grandifolia, large flowered bellwort. And you can see they are these very delicate stems. This is what they look like when they first start emerging. Their leaves aren't yet unfurled. Very easy to not observe. They have a bit of a glaucous appearance, so they have that blue-gray look to them, almost look maybe a little bit waxy. As they unfurl, you can see they get a lighter green color to them, but the undersides of the leaves are still got that blue glaucous look. So once they reach about 8-12 inches, they continue to grow taller. They put out 1 leaf at a time. It's alternate pattern. They put out 1 leaf at a time, and once they get to, like I said, 8 or 12 inches, the stem, which is quite soft, starts to fall over and droop. And then eventually the flower will emerge from here, and it is a 5-petaled yellow flower. Each petal is quite large, maybe 2 inches long, and it hangs upside down. It can make it so that if you're walking on flat ground or downhill, it can be a little bit difficult to spot those flowers, but if you're walking uphill, it's really easy to see. They are showy, but they're pointed downwards. So that's large flowered bellwort. It's a really special one. And it was neat to find this larger pod of it here. And finally, I would be remiss if I did not point this out to you. I am lucky enough to have Virginia bluebells, Mertensia virginiana, popping up in my landscaping. It's the only place on the property that we can find bluebells. And they're growing up in between these paving rocks. I do think that they are some leftover remnants before this house was built and the landscaping was put in. So they're just squeezing up between rocks. I'm not at all upset about it. In fact, I love it. They're really pretty. They often have this pink, purple, blue colored flowers. These ones are not yet open, but they are just starting to bloom. But probably more like mid-April is when they'd be in full bloom. They do put off quite a bit of seed, which is really nice. And it means that I have some little seedlings like these guys popping up down here. So they are spreading, which I'm encouraging. And they're really pretty ones. They often will cover the forest floor this time of year in low, flat floodplains. If you haven't gone out to a spot to see a huge abundance of bluebells when it's just a complete takeover of them, you definitely need to. They're so pretty. Thanks for taking a botany hike with me. Hopefully you learned a few species. Hopefully you are already familiar with a few of those species. Again, rained on lightly right now, so that's great. This might happen again, so let me know what you think. Offer any critiques. And next time I may travel a few miles down the road to Stemler Caves Nature Preserve, which is a sinkhole floodplain, and they might be a little bit further along in their spring because we burned here, so it kind of sets things back a little bit. And I'll imagine that I will be finding some different species there as well. I'm less familiar with the flora there and what they have specifically, but I'll give it a try. And have a great rest of your day. Bye.